It is now my pleasure to call on Professor Rebekka Voss, who comes to us from Frankfurt. Professor Voss in 2011 published Umstrittene Erlöser, you'll forgive my accent, on disputed messiahs, politics. The title is sort of Disputed Messiahs in English, Politics, Ideology, and Jewish-Christian Apocalypticism in Germany between 1500 and 1600. And her theme will be Eschatological Avengers or Messianic Saviors, Violence and Physical Strength in the Vernacular Legend of the Red Jews.
Thank you. What I would like to do is to talk about representation of violence. Some of it goes in a similar direction as did Adam's wonderful presentation yesterday. And together the topic of the representation of violence, I would actually like to link the discourse about Jews and violence to two other discourses. One is the discourse on Jewish masculinity, which also goes in the direction of the Jewish body debate. And the other one is to talk a little bit about power relations between the majority and the minority. What I'm going to do is, first I want to just throw out some general remarks about those three discourses, then go into the text and point out some important issues in these texts, and then in the end, by way of a conclusion, I would raise a few questions which I think we could discuss, and it's a work in progress, so I have many questions, not many answers, and I hope we find some more answers together. But please feel free to jump in at any time. I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but just jump in. And with regard to the text, I have to apologize that the Yiddish text got mixed up in a few places. It got reversed, so it will be correct when it's being put online. But it's a draft translation. So if you find anything that really doesn't make sense, please let me know. Okay, Jews and violence. Just to remind you of a few things, and I don't have to talk much about it. Jews are usually portrayed as victims of violence by the other, by the Christian other, by the Muslim other, as a member of the outside society. The possibility of Jews as perpetrators has been widely ignored. That changes a little bit it changes with the rise of the State of Israel. But there are recent studies of, let's say, the last decade by Israel Yuval, by Elliot Horowitz, and also by Ariel Toaf. And they do address Jewish violent behavior in various medieval and, to a lesser extent, also in various early modern contexts. They do point to examples of Jews bearing arms, fighting among themselves, fighting among Christians, to Jewish criminals, to Jewish violent fantasies and rituals. And we heard other examples yesterday and today, and we will hear more examples during the workshop, I guess. I will talk a little bit more about the discourse on Jewish masculinity, which I would like to raise as a possibility to put into the broader picture of Jews and violence. Because I think the perception of Jews as victims corresponds to the white-haired idea that Jewish men are different from non-Jewish men. They don't fight, they talk. And it seems in historiographic discourse that the sphere of violence and aggression, which is generally, that's my impression, regarded as a male domain, doesn't seem to be the natural habitat of Jewish men. I would just like to bring a small quote from Philip Roth in his memoir, Patrimony, from 1991. Here it says, I quote, "We are the sons upheld by violence, with no capacity for inflicting physical pain, useless at beating and clubbing, unfit to pulverize even the most deserving enemy. We have teeth, as the cannibals do, but they are there, embedded in our jaws, the better to help us articulate. When we lay waste, when we efface, it isn't with raging fists or ruthless schemes or insane sprawling violence, but with our words, our brains, with mentality, end quote. The stereotype of the unmanly Jewish man, I would suggest, takes on different shapes and runs deep in European thought and in culture, in historiography, and has both negative and positive connotations. There's the stereotypes that Jews are smarter than non-Jews, that they are more delicate and gentle in character, that they're unwarlike, that they're even like women in body and mind, that they are devoted to their families more than Christian men, things like that. Just one example, the myth of the Christian myth of Jewish male menstruation is found in many medieval and early modern writings. For example, you have it in the writings by the French cardinal and historian Jacques de Vitry in the 13th century, and I could cite many more examples. And this topic has been researched, so you can look it up. And then we have the notion of the effeminate Jew, which pops up in the discourse on debates on Jewish emancipation. For example, that the Jew is unfit for military service. But the label of the effeminate Jew is more pervasively and more viciously used with the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-feminism, and especially with regard to German militant, aggressive, and hyper-masculine identity, nationalism. And it's this influence on Jewish culture has also been looked at. For example, and I would say most importantly, by Sander Gilman, who's focusing on Jewish self-hatred. So these are just a few things I would like to throw out. And one example of this discourse in recent scholarship is the book by Daniel Boyarin, Unheroic Conduct. Here he argues for the invention of the, let's say, soft Jewish man, the gentle Jewish man as a counter-image to the gentile ideal of the muscled and aggressive manliness. And Boyarin claims that it's a unique model of masculinity and was characteristic of Jewish culture from antiquity to the modern times. It is interesting, I think, that the link between violence and masculinity is picked up in the Jewish culture, or let's say restored, by Zionist self-fashioning. I would just like to mention the discourse on the new Jew, the muscular Jew. If you look into the writing the writings of Max Nordau, for example, this discourse emphasizes Jewish resistance, and it emphasizes the overcoming of a passivity which is closely linked to an existence in the diaspora. And I think this points to a third important dimension for our topic of Jews and violence, because it seems to clearly link violence to power and dominance, and it goes a little bit in the direction of state violence. And what I think is instructive is the afterword by Shlomo Simonsen in a volume on violence and defense in the Jewish experience, edited by Salo Baron and George Weiss in 1977, and Bernie cited it in his preliminary remarks when we were talking about setting up this workshop. And here Simonson says, and I think it's very important, in ancient times, quote, "The Jewish nation was a normal nation, and its attitudes to war and violence were normal, like those of other nations," end quote. And this, I think, it seems to imply that exerting violence is only possible or is normal, is maybe even only legitimate from a strong position. That means not from a position of an oppressed minority. So it goes in the direction of state violence. So it seems to me that the links between violence, masculinity, involving physical strength, and I will get to that in a moment, and also linked to dominance, to power, seems to run deep in history and also in historiography. And I'm not the first to raise this point, obviously. There have been explorations of this link in scholarship in the last 10 years. There's an interesting volume by, for example, Warren Rosenberg, Legacy of Rage, Jewish Masculinity, Violence and Culture, published in 2001. It explores the stereotype of Jewish men being non-violent in modern American fiction. Another one, also focusing modern times, is a volume edited by Benjamin Maria Bada, Sharon Gillerman, and Paul Lerner. It's on Jewish masculinities, 2012. It explores maleness, manliness among German Jews. Again, it focuses on modern times. There's just one article which is actually very interesting by Andreas Gottsmann, focusing on the early modern times, but I still think it points to an important link that I would like to take to the early modern times today and explore those links between, again, violence, masculinity, physical strength, and power for the early modern times. I would do that by looking at the myth of the Red Jews. The context is Messianism. I will just very briefly introduce it for those of you who don't know this myth. The Red Jews are basically the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It's an entangled popular myth in Jewish and Christian culture. It only exists in German lands. It only exists, which is interesting, in vernacular culture, so we only have German texts about this myth in the Christian context, no Latin texts. In the Jewish context, it's only found in Yiddish texts, it's not found in Hebrew texts. So what's the myth? The myth of the Red Jews is of Christian origins. It basically says that the Red Jews living beyond the Sambatyon are the horrible army of Antichrist. At the end of times, they will be called by Antichrist to destroy Christian Europe. This Christian myth had been analyzed by Andrew Gow. Just very briefly, the myth in the Christian context popped up in the late 13th century, and it's basically a combination of three different legends. It's the legend of the 10 lost tribes, which I just mentioned. It's and those 10 tribes are identified with the unclean nations that Alexander enclosed. And again, those unclean nations are identified with Gog and Magog. So basically, the Red Jews are the horrific red army of Antichrist, meaning they are the 10 tribes, Gog and Magog, enclosed by Alexander. This notion was immensely popular in Germany, in popular thought, in writings, in theology, in the Middle Ages, through the early modern times. It's interesting that this notion in the Christian context, it disappears around 1600. There are different reasons, and I don't want to go into this much more. I think one part of the reason why it disappears is that the Turks are perceived as a much greater actual danger in Christian Germany than the 10 tribes before, and even the Red Jews are seen as possible allies against the Turks. Another interesting issue that maybe could be taken into account is this an argument by Matthew Biberman, who works on early modern English literature, and there he says, or he traces a change of the perception of the Jew in English literature in the early modern times, and he sees a change from the satanic, over-masculine Jew of the Middle Ages to the effeminate Jew of the modern times. And he says this notion first pops up or develops in English literature in the Renaissance, and it is fully developed with the rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th century. So that's something I think we could keep in mind, and maybe it helps us to talk about the perception of Jews and violence. The Red Jews in the Jewish context, they possibly come up in the late Middle Ages. The first documents I have on the term Rote Jidele, or in Western Yiddish Rote Juden, are actually from the beginning of the 16th century, but reading the sources implies that the term and the motif has been taken from the German, from the Christian context, sometime in the late Middle Ages. And by the 16th century, it was widely used among German Jews, and they basically called the 10 lost tribes the Red Jews, Rote Juden. The motif is basically the same. The Christian nightmare is confirmed. The Red Jews are the army of the Messiah in the end of times. They will come and take revenge on the Christians. And here the concept of which Israel Yuval raised, the Messiah of revenge, comes into play. What I want to do now is to look at the texts, to look at how the Red Jews are described in the two texts I brought, and which I included in the booklet. How are they described first in the German tradition, and how are they described in the Yiddish tradition? And especially, how are they described with regard to violence? The first text on page, what is it?
80. 80.
No, actually the other one, I want to start with the medieval German text. It starts on page 91. The text is a Middle High German verse romance dealing with the Trojan War of Greek mythology, and obviously the most important source here is the most known source is Homer's Iliad, but there are many, many more texts on that, and one of them is this German adaptation or German source. It was written probably by a Swiss around 1300. The manuscript was found in Lower Austria in the Abbey Göttweig, and that's why it's called Göttweiger Trojanerkrieg, Trojan War. I took the German text from the edition by Kupitz, and the translation is not my own. It's by Andrew Gow. I just took a little part of it, which involves the Red Jews. The context is that, and you know this context, Helena, the wife of the king of Sparta, is kidnapped by Paris, the son of the king of Troy, and the Greeks go on war against Troy to take revenge. So that's the first important thing, I think, because violence is countered by violence, and that's taken for granted, and we see that again in the text on the Red Jews, the Yiddish text. Okay, how are the Red Jews described in the German text? They're described as huge and horrible. Virtue and modesty were perverted in all of them. They are described as being strong. They're described as being dangerous warriors. They are described as being hellhounds. They all wore terrifyingly solid body plates of horn. That's on page 92. Yes, 92. Their helmets were of shiny metal. Their shields were fitted together well and skillfully forged. Actually, that's unclear in the German context. They are described as violent persecutors. They kill many of the Greeks. I said that they are described as being immoral. They're described as foul and unnatural, and I'm not sure what this unnatural means. Does it mean unnaturally immoral or unnaturally dangerous? Maybe both. It's on page 91. And what I find is very, very interesting, that also the sounds of violence come into play in this text. Because on page 92, 93, it said that the shouting and the yelling of the Red Jews, it says, made by these creatures, was so extremely loud that no one can describe it properly. And great and terrifying was the horror of battle. And it seems to me that it's not only the looks of violence, but also the sounds of violence that are important for the text. And they are so horrible, they are so terrifying that even experienced warriors like Ulysses, like the best warriors of the Greeks are scared of the Red Jews. And it's yeah.
Is it the sound of violence or the sound of Red Jews?
It's a good question. It's the sound of the Red Jews, but I think it's also the sound of violence, because here on page 91, it says the Red Jews, they are so unnatural that anyone who looked at them closely experienced a physical reaction of fright.
You know Ruth Hefferhan's work on Jews in music? The idea that Jews are very often associated, both in Western music and in text about Jews as noisy, as the noises of the synagogue. It's just horrible to hear.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very interesting association, a long-term association between Jews and poets.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's such an interesting text because it brings together Greek tropes, but also this element of the Jews that it's so out of place from the Greek mythology. And actually, my question doesn't have to do with the description of the Jews per se, but Ulysses is described as faint-hearted, which is a bizarre description for Ulysses. Clever, but not necessarily faint-hearted. And the other thing is that I found interesting is that Venus is brought in to destroy the Jews, right? So Venus is the goddess of love. Now she is connected to Mars, but there are all these interesting, bizarre elements. Can you contextualize the text a little more?
You're right, there are many interesting elements, and I haven't, again, that's a work in progress, so I haven't really looked at every single motif. For the first one, the faint-hearted, I think it's basically he's faint-hearted, and I think he then even fleds.
Yeah, he's fearful,
yeah,
man.
he runs away from battle. That's because he's a coward in face of the Red Jews, because they are so horrible. So I think it elevates.
But Ulysses is the man that gets he fights. He doesn't fight, but he fights his own fear in front of the sirens. So it's.
But then again, I
such
think.
a bizarre reworking of the
Right.
that must have been present to the mind of whoever wrote.
But I think again, I would say it really emphasizes the Red Jews being so horrible that even somebody like Ulysses, who's not known as faint-hearted at all, would be scared of them.
What I don't understand here is why I think it must be Cow's remark that it says Hercules, that is Ulysses, right?
Oh, it's not Gao. It's in the edition by Kupitz, and he finds it in other manuscripts. It's just that's why I put. It's not Hercules meant. It's Ulysses, and he interpolates it from different manuscripts.
Okay, but maybe we don't have to take it for granted that it's Ulysses.
But I mean, but in the first one, Ulysses, the faint-hearted, there it's clear that it's Ulysses, and it's. I mean, we know this from the story that it's Ulysses.
It's kind of a Homeric description to say the faint-hearted is very much in the model of Homeric descriptive words. So much so that I don't think that he's responding. It's like Ulysses, the cunning,
Yeah,
would be
this
more
is the
difficult,
faint-hearted.
but
Yeah.
this would not, unless this is the use of some irony the idea that he was driven into fear by the Red Jews sounds like he comes to us as Ulysses the faint-hearted.
Yeah.
Or,
That was also my impression, which leads me to ask you whether
and also
this is a
afterwards,
parodic text.
it says fearful man that he was, not that he was made fearful.
And so in Homer, if you read Homer, it's Ulysses adjective
Yeah.
Yeah.
describing Ulysses
Yeah.
is
The,
and here is the fearful or the faint-hearted. Is it at all possible that this is a Greek text or a parodic text, which doesn't undermine your argument at all about how the Jews are described, but it puts the text in just a
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. I mean, I think we see a similar issue in the Yiddish text because it's also kind of comedic. It's satiric. Because I think it undermines the strength or the bravery of Ulysses even more if it's put in a comic context. But I have to look more closely at the context of the text. But you're right. He seems to come as faint-hearted, but again, a few lines later, at the bottom of the page, with regard to the noble knights, it said that they were the best knights, and certainly it never before made them so anxious. So it seems that this battle against the Red Jews, it's exceptionary. It's exceptionary. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the Yiddish text. The name of the king.
The name of the
king,
Mm-hmm.
Martin from Mainz. I
Mhm.
confess that purposely have to Google it to see something to pop up, and I got nothing. Maybe I can find Google, but the text is supposed to be not temporal, right? To be happening someplace. Why would they have a name and a name that is not also mythical? It's not Ulysses. It's not someone late in
I think because to grant it authenticity, that's why you have this king, and you have cities which are mentioned, and you have numbers of people who were killed. You have names. You have historic persons in those texts. So it's to lend it authenticity, and also to bring it into the early modern presence. And that's something I will come back to. It's not like a myth that happens in antiquity somewhere. The Red Jews they've been perceived by Jews and Christians as a force that was there, that lived somewhere in the eastern distance. Just people didn't know where they lived, but they were seen as a real existing people.
So this king, it's not a national king, right?
No.
This person, Martin von Mainz, did not exist. So
No.
they made up a name that it could
Yes.
be reliable.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Ivan?
I think there's another dimension that should be mentioned. This is actually that the Mongol invasions from the east also
Yeah.
motivated or caused or raised some of those issues of barbarians
Mhm.
coming from the east to Europe and attacking Europe. Actually, they attacked Eastern Europe in those times. I mean, the 13th century. And we have different legends in the Christian society about those Mongols. So some of them consider them to be kind of faithful Christians who are going to save Christianity despite the attacks on Europe. I mean, the legends of Prester John.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, we have those legends that connect the Mongols to the Red Jews.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah.
another issue that should be mentioned.
Right. It's there certainly is the context of the Mongol invasions, and Gao also refers to that when he talks about how the term Red Jews came into being. I think it is not entirely clear. You're right. The Mongols have been identified as the 10 lost tribes, but it's not clear if really this term Red Jews comes from the Mongols, because apparently they wore like a red headgear, but really it's not clear. It's a possible link, but we don't know it. Okay, I think it's important to look at to consider the looks and the sounds of violence, because when I read those texts, there must be some emotional reaction of the reader when reading the text, when listening to the text, and hearing about those violent images, the sounds of violence being described. So I think that's something we could consider, maybe also with regard to other texts, that it seems to me the text talks about the physical reaction of fright with regard to the Greek warriors, but maybe it's also we can also talk about the physical reaction of fright or imagined reaction on part of the readers or listeners. So I think it's important to look at how violence is imagined in an audio visual way. So that's something I want to throw out. And I think we see it again in the Yiddish text. Okay, the Yiddish text, which is the first text, it starts on page 80. And I forgot to put the date. It's a text from between 1580 to 1600. It's found in a manuscript from Oxford. It's a manuscript of edifying tales. It's a Musa manuscript. And we have, as I said, we have different tales, and which is very interesting. I think it's 7 or 8 tales altogether, and we have 2 versions of the Red Jew story. One is this, which I brought, and it's the most popular one, the oldest known version of the Red Jew's tale. It's called in scholarly literature Maaseh Akdamut, the story of Akdamut, because in this story it basically it's the legend of how the Piyut of Akdamut, which is recited according to the Ashkenazi rite in Shavuot, why it was written, how it was written, and this legendary story involves the Red Jews. We have several early modern Yiddish versions of the Red Jew story, and this story, Akdamut Milim, was printed first in Cremona around 1560. It's now lost. The title was Megillas Reb Meir, and it was reprinted in Yiddish in the 17th and 18th century 4 times at least, 4 more times, in Amsterdam and in Fürth. I think I don't have to say more about the context of the text. If we look at the text, what's the plot and what's happening? It talks about a black monk. In those days, a black monk appeared who enjoyed to take revenge on the Jews. And when he saw a Jew, he touched him, and the Jew died. So we're talking here about violence as being something physical. And it's said that just touching a Jew, the monk killed about more than 30,000 Jews. Mm-hmm.
Could you give an explanation why black monk?
I think because when you look at the typology of the text, the monk seems to symbolize the Antichrist, and in the printing from Fürth, 1694, it says that he touches the Jews in the forehead, which is the Antichrist, the Christian Antichrist legend says that the followers of Antichrist are touched on the forehead, and then they have the sign of Antichrist, and also he's working with black magic.
Isn't black monk the difference between Dominicans and Franciscans?
Okay.
It could be literary, but
Yeah, could be, but on a symbolic level.
Yeah.
it read to me like a Jesus counter narrative. Jesus heals, he touches and kills, and then he.
Right, yeah.
And then on the page 84, the 31b, and the text that we have, the monk is saying, "How did you abandon me, my dear master?" And that's really reference to Eli Lama Azartani in the Gospels. God, Jesus,
right.
why did you abandon me? And I think it
But
seems
the whole Antichrist legend is a
Right.
counter gospel, so this just
Yeah.
confirms
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Yeah, so when you said it was
Right.
the Antichrist, I'm like, yeah, this is exactly where,
Yeah.
because it's really read,
Yeah, you're
that
right.
there are these subtle references to things that Jesus does, but the other way around.
And in the end, he fails. I mean,
Right.
It seems
his
to
magic
be
doesn't work anymore.
Pretty embedded in Toldot Yeshu tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's somewhere there.
Yeah, like
Toldot
the
Yeshu.
magic, the use
Yes,
of
yes, yes,
magic,
it's
the
definitely,
thing that
yeah,
he then
yeah.
loses the ability to,
Right. Okay, and then what happens, I think, is interesting because the Jews decide to complain to the king. So they go back to what Yerushalmi has termed as the royal alliance. But then, that's interesting, they were afraid that the king wouldn't be able to protect them from the monk. So apparently, it's the first way, the first try to deal with violence, to deal with a monk, but it doesn't work. It's the first idea is to go to the king, but then the monk even kills some of the Jews in front of the king. And then they propose a different alternative. They propose to repent, and I cut this part out, but it's described how they repented, what they did, and then in the end, a scholar falls asleep over his books, and he has a vision, and then he says, and it's on page 81 probably.
81?
Yeah, it's on 81. I have to go back because the monk says, "Okay, I stop killing the Jews. If in 1 year they can send me somebody to stand up against me in a sorcery competition who's a better magician than I am," and the Jews have to agree. And then they repent, and again it didn't work because they hoped that the monk would just die within this 1 year, but no, it didn't happen. And then the scholar, and again I think it's interesting because also the second alternative didn't work. The king couldn't protect the Jews, and also the repenting didn't work. So the scholar who has this vision, he says that you won't find anybody to compete with a monk in a sorcery competition, not in this country, not in the land of Israel, but you have to go beyond the Sabbation to the Red Jews because they are masters of the divine name. And then there's like some funny remark that those people say, but why do we have to send anybody to the Red Jews? Why can't just God send us this Red Jew so we don't have to go there and fetch him and violate Sabbath? So it's interesting, but that's just a side remark. And then the Red Jews sent one of them to help the Jews against the black monk. And you see that it's the motif of David against Goliath. It's this Red Jew is described as being weak, he's old and limping, and in some other versions he's blind in one eye, he just has one arm, or he's a little kid, and he could even be a girl. So it's somebody who's really not a strong warrior. And when you read the Yiddish text, it really reads like the biblical story about the fight between David and Goliath. Everybody doubts that the Red Jew can stand up to the monk because of his appearance.
And that really struck me more Moshe and Pharaoh. When Moshe, he's handicapped in not a physical way, but in terms of his ability to speak. So he's handicapped in one way, and you have there precisely this question of magical powers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another parallel you should perhaps keep in mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought about David and Goliath first because
Yeah, little and big. I mean,
yeah, little and big, and also
competition of magic, right? With
absolutely.
Yeah,
and you have
that's-
the star.
yeah.
And you have the star.
yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
It's a
Definitely, yeah. It's. I think
Yeah,
it's both because I do have a Hebrew version where the words of the monk are they're literally taken from the Bible, and they are the words of Goliath. And then again, it's because of the little and the huge, and also because the redness of the red juice in the Yiddish story is taken from David being red, being Admoni,
Right,
and
yeah.
it's, yeah. So that's why I had this one first in mind. But thank you. Okay, so everybody doubt that this the little red Jew can stand up to the monk. And it's interesting how they describe him. He's never described as being a man or a Jew. He's always called Little Red Jew, Rot Jutlein in the Yiddish original. He's described as little man. He's described as mannequin in the Yiddish Männchen. He's described as being limping, being weak, and then he's set into contrast to the monk, because it said, how can such a little mannequin can stand up to such a monk who's so strong and huge? And all those motifs appear again when the little red Jew finally in the sorcery competition steps up against the monk, because then he says, "You make fun of me. Why do you send this little mannequin? It's just, I mean, he just cannot stand up to me."
Rebekka,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a witchcraft context for this in general.
Mhm.
I mean, something needs to be said about that. And in witchcraft accusations, I mean, we can go to biblical stories, but you know, we know that in witchcraft accusations, it was usually the weak that were accused of
Yeah.
witchcraft, right? The lonely old woman,
Right.
It's not the powerful who are accused
Yeah.
of it. And I think there's something to be said about
Mhm.
that.
Thank you. Because I think the function of magic in this text somehow undermines the link between violence and physical violence and being physically strong. Because it said, in the end, you read the text, the red Jew obviously kills the monk and is victorious. And it's said that he has done so because of the use of divine names, so he uses magic also, and he's basically just a divine instrument. And then on the other hand, also
legitimate magic.
Yeah, it's
He's
legitimate,
supported by
yeah, right.
the
Yeah.
divine name and not the demons.
right. But also the monk, he also is he can.
Is the word violence the right word here?
Hmm?
Is the word violence the right word here? Harm by magic, maleficia, seems to me to be the right way to do it.
But it's a kind of violence, right? Which we heard yesterday in the typology also, and I think it is physical violence if we are talking about Jews being killed, and also in the end, just a minute, in this magical contest, it all revolves on we have this pole and the monks basically he's spared on the pole and his head is chopped off, so that's pretty violent.
But you see, the narrative starts with violence.
Yeah.
Right? The 13th century narrative starts with violence, and then it's interesting to see how it changes. Now, it will be interesting to see how the early modern German texts change in terms of the portrayal of these red Jews, whether they also transition into the counter-violence, or whether they are, as in Adam's case, the Jewish texts are in fact undermining the notions of Jews as violent defenders or beings, that they only do things through the support of God, the divine name.
I think that's a tension you find in the text, and I'm getting to that because we don't have so much more time. I think in the Yiddish text you have two competing concepts of violence and how to deal with violence. On the one side, you have the traditional notion which links violence, physical strength, and dominance, and here the monk is representative. He's the Christian other, he's the violent oppressor. That's clear. But you also have it in the figure of the Red Jew, because, as I said, it's doubted that he can stand up to the monk. So apparently, we can see that people reading the story or listening to the story, they expected the Red Jew to be a brave warrior, to be somebody who looks like he could fight against the monk, and this corresponds to how the 10 tribes are described in the Hebrew tradition. So again, the images of violence are, in the traditional notion, created by linking violence to physical strength, I would say. And also, the two alternative reactions that are proposed are the Royal Alliance to call to the king and repentance, and they both fail. And I would suggest that the Red Jew seems to be some sort of a compromise or a paradox here, because in the end he kills the monk by an act of, I would say, by a violent act. I said his head is chopped off. He's basically he's stuck on the pole. But the Red Jew does it without being strong. He's described as weak. And also, the story says it a few times, that the Red Jew says to the monk, "I won't touch you, I won't kill you," and then it's explained it's not the Red Jew doing it. He's basically an instrument of the divine, because he's doing it through legitimate magic. But again, it seems to me that this image of violence and physical strength is somehow necessary for the story. Because, I mean, the Red Jew could have just also turned the monk into a white rabbit, and that's fine. So you don't need like the violent magical contest. And I think it's important, and why? It seems to me that the readers are somehow receptive to those violent images. It's something that makes the story interesting, and the climax of the story is the magical contest. It's a prolonged, very detailed description. And I was wondering if we can see here a tension between the belief in violence, that you have violent outbreaks by Jews against Christians, in similar way that Adam described yesterday, and at the other hand, you have a strategy of trying to basically to civilize people, to say that's not the proper behavior. The others, the Christians, are violent, but we should have different ways of dealing or of countering violence. So I was wondering if there's a tension between social ideal and reality, which I find in the text.
There was an article that was published very recently by Eli Yassif in Haaretz on the myth of the lost 10 tribes.
All right, it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yes,
I've
so
seen
it
that.
traces some of those legends from the first century, from the first century of the Common Era. His explanation or his theory is that the lost tribes are actually some kind of ideal representation of Judaism in the Middle Ages, or in the Jewish tradition. Something that the Jews in the Christian lands or in the Muslim lands desired to be like. So maybe it's very similar in this case as well. But
but
it deals
then-
with a minority and majority, and the idea of exile, and the idea, on the other hand, the red Jews, or the lost tribes actually having their own land, they are independent, they have their own traditions, and don't compromise about their religion and so on.
Right, but I just want to point out that there is a striking difference between the Hebrew text about describing the 10 tribes as strong warriors, and the Yiddish text is describing the red Jews as weak and not capable of doing violent stuff. Yeah, Elisha?
Yeah.
I just want to make a small comment. First of all, for the record, I kind of object to having Ariel Toaf's work being mentioned in the same breath as Yuval and Elliot Horowitz and others. I think I personally object to it, and I want that to be stated for the record. But more than that, I think that it's a very rich text. There's so much here to engage. You have a lot of work, I think, cut out for you. But I think, this is a literary fantasy. This is not the same as the, crenellated synagogues we saw, in which you're talking about actually training for military engagement. So I still feel that there's a line between the fantasies of maybe the powerless that empower only in the imagination versus historical reality, and I don't think that we've explored that enough here. We're kind of eluding and looking at images in the fantasy as though they're virtually historical, but they're not. And I just
Yeah, that's a good point. But I'm just trying to suggest that the image of Jews being described as weak, it may be seen in a similar context as part of fashioning a self-identity which is not connected to violence. But you're certainly right. It's a totally different text.
Yeah. We only have 2 minutes literally, so maybe we'll ask the questions, and then Rebekka, you'll get 1 minute
Okay.
to sort of respond, and then we can continue over coffee outside.
I want to second on Elisha's observation. Yes, we are dealing here not with one fantasy, but with two fantasies. Because German text is also a fantasy.
Yeah.
Because it is a fantasy, I believe you need a much better literary context for both of the texts. And I like Francesca's observation that the first German text is certainly a parody. You need not only to look at how medieval German sources that deal with parodia sacra treat, let's say, Homeric texts, but also how they treat the Greek parodies of Homer, like, for instance, Patrachomio the famous Greek text that is a parody of Trojan Wars that has animals fighting with one another. And this text is very animalistic and definitely builds on this parody of the classical Greek sources, I mean the German text. As far as the Jewish text goes, it also belongs to a literary tradition, and I very strongly recommend that you look at the Talmudic sources, where you have a number of cases where rabbis are debating with one another, resorting to magic, and I'm not a Talmudist, I'm not a medievalist, but the first thing that comes to mind is Tanur Aknai, the discussion of whether this particular stove is kosher or not, and there the rabbi who is arguing it is resorts to magic. He says, if I'm right, this river will fly back. If I'm right, this tree will jump 20 feet that way. And by the way, the tree that jumps and hits somebody is there in the Talmud, and it is also here in the text. So I just urge you to do more contextualizing. When you know what the text is quoting, you will be able to say what it contributes, what is the new representation that is not just quoting old sources, but is contributing something new.
You're certainly right. I looked at some of the motifs. There's much from the Midrash, and yeah, I just didn't bring everything here.
I have only a simple question, a very short one, and that is something that came up in the very first talk. violence as entertainment. Maybe, you know, it's like, I'm from day-to-day history, maybe this is just entertaining, and I'm sure that there are layers, wine, and how and so on, but it might be for entertainment and not historical.
Certainly, yes.
Jerzy, you want to say?
Okay, very quickly, I think that you have a very strong tradition in Sephardic Judaism of a warrior Jews and the question of chazars and their strength and so on. And the question is to what extent that's being applied. I don't know. I'm just asking because it's there.
Yeah.
And I,
What was it?
just a comment on, I think, maybe I misunderstood, but the tradition of the Jewish sorcerer doesn't die out in the Middle Ages. It actually perhaps becomes even stronger in the early modern period with the spread of Kabbalah and the Christian reception of Kabbalah. So the notion that Jews are powerful magicians is widespread also in the lower classes in Christian society. And that may be another context to explore further.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are
So
many different
Jews
contexts.
may be weak, but in fact they hold this powerful magic.
And I'm just going to take advantage of my position to simply mention David Ruveni, who is a border figure between self-fashioning and reality, but who creates an image in his own diary of fighting battles, and yet he is regarded as a weak person. I mean, so
If he
that's-
ever written his diary.
Huh?
If he has ever written his diary.
Shh. I don't like that. Rebekka, you have the last word if you want it.
Thank you for your comments.